You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Jim Harryman of Kinetic Group. Welcome, Jim.
Morning. Good to be here.
And is it Kinetic Technology Group or is it just Kinetic Group?
It's Kinetic Technology Group. Yeah.
I just abbreviated because we have so much to talk about today and then I added it back in. So
it's all good.
We were talking right before we got started, and this has been something that's been kind of an ongoing conversation about what are the little things that we can do in either our own environments or client environments. Shoot, sometimes it might just be when you're at a family gathering and you have the conversation about using LastPass or some other, password manager that would take away the I got to memorize, 50 passwords. In fact, I had my oldest help me load a deep freeze to take to the dump. It just stopped working. And on the way back, he was asking me a question about a password, and he was saying how difficult it is to try and remember 20 passwords. And I'm like, you're my son and you don't know these small things. And so I shared with him like using LastPass. And so this weekend, I helped him set up LastPass personal so that he could be more secure. And the reason that this is kind of important, because we all talk about it with our clients, how do you present the value proposition? And he said, but Dad, someone getting onto my computer because they know my password, the probability of that isn't very high, is it? And I said, no. I said, but what's the probability of that password being some variation of what you might use with like Google Mail or, Twitter or Snapchat or whatever? And he goes, oh yeah. He's like, I go, and what's that threat surface look like? He's like, oh wow. He's like, yeah, they don't have to get to my computer to get to those things, do they? I go, no. I said, so part of the reason you're seeing a change in the industry as a whole is securing your endpoint with a password is kind of strange, because you have to get to that endpoint to do anything else, versus I'm on the internet and I know you use Google and I don't have to be in any specific location to start attacking you. So at any rate, as this sort of conversation has progressed over the last couple of weeks, I wanted to talk to you, or really I was very, picky. I said to the advisory group, is anybody available to talk about the little things? And part of that wasn't because I needed you or I needed someone because I couldn't do this episode, but I thought this should be an episode that no matter who I ask this question to has somewhere between 1 and 5 things that off the top of their head, they literally go, oh yeah, I do XYZ and provide value, or I mitigate a vulnerability. So Jim, you've been doing this a long time, probably as long, if not longer than I have. And I think in the world of technology, that's like, a blink of an eye. This isn't the Industrial Revolution, right? This hasn't been around that long. So Jim, when thinking about security and the world that we're in, let's start with one. What's one thing that you can think of that you would do to help change, whether it's providing value or showing vulnerability to a client or even to your own staff?
Well, I think the password thing that we talked about is definitely a, low-hanging fruit that any MSP or IT consultant or whatever can ask a prospect or an existing client for that matter. It's like, well, what is your expectation, or what do you think your password policy is?
Right.
And just generating that question, because as we know, many people, and you've had clients that have had, a simple password. Even if it was longer, it was easily easily cracked or brute
Right.
forced
Right.
in a short period of time. So I think that is certainly one thing that is an easy thing to show value and say, we at Kinetic have established a policy internally of password requirements, right?
Mhm.
And we have worked really hard to push that down across our client base over time. I mean, you can't do it all at once, but it's a process to say, look, these are things that we're doing. We think you should do it, and taking that to it. I think another one that comes to mind really quick that doesn't cost anything to do other than the time it takes to implement. In our case, we would just do it in coordination with our clients, wouldn't charge them extra above and beyond what they pay us. But MFA, right? I mean, turning MFA on for email is a simple thing. It is disruptive
Mhm.
to the client that's never done that. But that's what we're there to hold their hand and to take them and guide them through those types of things, and make it a successful transition, right? So I think that those are kind of the two things that really popped to mind. I mean, we were to the point, it's like, well, if you're not going to do it, then we're not going to support you anymore. If you're not going to
Right.
turn on MFA, we're not going to support you anymore, because we're not going to absorb that risk, right?
Yeah.
So that's really, but those are a couple of things that come to mind right off the top of my head. That it's like, it's real easy to do. It's two really, really important things that just at the basic level of securing yourself in this
Sure.
landscape that we live in now. So,
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I think that there's so much to that is like little incremental things. So regardless of what mail environment it is, I had one the other day. I was a 365 environment, and they had no problem telling me that their compromise that had happened to them was not tied to 365, or at least that's what they believed. And we did some digging, because they were real quick to point out, all of our users are using MFA. I'm like, awesome. As part of this process, I'd like to just do a quick check on users and make sure that that's exactly what you're saying. And lo and behold, it's not a large organization, 50, I think roughly 50 users. They had one user that had the legacy app connector actually active. Not that it was, because it was obviously turned on for everybody, because it's not on and off for one user. But I said, you have no way of knowing now if your vulnerability wasn't actually that user account, because there was no MFA, and they literally, all they had to do was sit on their, and wait for that thing to connect, and like, boom, they're in. And so we started having that conversation about turning that legacy connector off, and then they're like, well, why doesn't Microsoft do that? And I said, well, why doesn't Microsoft do a lot of things that, we would like? We're offering you one small change has this huge impact on your entire organization. And you were hung up on the fact that you had MFA turned on, right? Like, it's that whole conversation we like to have. It's a binary switch without a binary result, right? Like, the result is not binary. So sort of like carrying on with that, you talked about some of the value propositions of like multi-factor, what is your password policy? And so that made me start thinking about, like, what are the tools that might help me in showing value without being either a significant drain on my resources or being an overhead because I have to pay money for the tool. And so I started playing around with some password auditors. Spec Ops was one. KnowBe4 has one, and I know there's lots of others. And even if it's just a trial of a product, as long as it doesn't require a lot of lifting to get it stood up, it may be exactly what you need for a sort of a one-off, knowing that you may have a tool that's going to do a great job of that, later. Like, I'm talking more like, this isn't an existing client where you might have thrown in like LionGuard or Netrix or one of those like always on auditors. But as I was going through that process, I discovered a lot of things that I didn't know that were like, they were little things with huge impact. So couple things that come to mind for me, especially if you're still dealing with environments that run Active Directory. Who set up the environment? Was it MSP previous? Was it MSP 2 or 3 ago? Was it, an internal IT guy that left and new management came in and now they've hired, you to be the MSP? I think Active Directory is one of the number one places where be careful what you turn over because you won't like what you find. And I don't think that's unique to bad predecessors. I think it's the evolution of AD environments that were by and large upgraded or updated, not start over from scratch. Another example would be like the network storage, right? File storage, right? You have an AD environment with shares from like 2004, and those shares have continued on indefinitely. When was the last time someone went back and checked for like inherited permissions?
Who has access? Sure.
Right. And so like I had shared with you, I did an audit on one environment where instead of adding users who needed to be part of like a domain administrator group, they added the domain administrator group to the users group. And so you couldn't troubleshoot that very easily without putting a tool in place to like find it, because again, it was like a needle in a haystack. It didn't make any sense. And every time I'd go in and look at a user and I'm like, oh, I'll just go into the user and I'll delete those groups or delete those security permissions out, click, save, go on to the next user. And I think I was like 10 users in when I'm like, I should check and see if inherited permissions are getting reapplied to those users before I try and do this with a large group. And I went back in there and sure enough, they were inheriting the permissions and I couldn't break the inheritance. I had to go and find where the group was being added and remove it there. And so then you're going, okay, well, what happens if I don't have a user that does need these privileges? What if that user suddenly no longer has those privileges and they need it? So anyways, I'm saying just because you run the tool doesn't mean you should, pull the ripcord and hope for the best. So that was my experience, was like, hey, what happens when you run an auditing tool of any kind? Does it give you meaningful data that you can share with the client or help you make decisions about whether or not you want to onboard that client? So, okay, so we've kind of revolved this a little bit around MFA, passwords, password policies. I'm sure you got at least one more.
Gosh, let me think for just a second. I think that another kind of easy thing for us to show these days, maybe you get into security awareness.
Sure.
Okay. All right. And how we're actually doing that. I mean, as managed service providers, we have a tendency to, we see the shiny gadget, right? We buy the shiny gadget and we turn on the shiny gadget, and then we just think that everything's going to be,
we should probably do a whole series on that, like how to break the habit, how to get a support group. Like I know I've done at least 2 episodes just on shiny object syndrome, because I think it's an actual disease in the managed services space.
Yeah, it is. And, it is something that we do. But I mean, ultimately, one of the strategies that we've started to take now, and we've been a real proponent of the security awareness training. I mean, we've been partners with, various companies that do that type of product. But we realized, more recently over the last couple of years that we need to take a little bit more active role in that with our clients, because just sending out, training videos and doing phishing simulations and stuff like that. I mean, it's good. And it's a start, but that's all it is. It's a start, because I think that we do have to have real conversations with not only the leaders of the companies that we support, but even getting in front of the staff and just, saying, hey, look, if it looks funny or fishy or whatever, it probably is. Right. And so, and what's really cool, and I don't toot my own horn very often, but occasionally there are things that I'm like, even before security awareness training products were really out there and available to small organizations like us.
Yeah.
I was all over it with our clients, meeting with people and saying, look, if you have a question about an email or you're unsure or something, hey, forward it over to us and let us evaluate it. And all of our clients, bar none, even to this day, even with all the other stuff, it's like we get at least a dozen emails a week forwarded over to us from various clients saying, hey, this doesn't look right. I'm like, it doesn't, because it's not right. And so but it is that didn't happen just by osmosis. I mean, it happened from being proactive with your customer and having those conversations and saying it is fishy, it is bad.
So when I was in high school, I'll never forget this. My ninth grade English teacher had this poster on his wall, and the poster said, "He who asks a foolish question is a fool for 5 minutes. He who does not ask a foolish question is a fool forever." And that has stuck with me for my entire life. I'm good at asking foolish questions, but I think his point is that we all have foolish questions. But if we don't ask those questions, we're never going to gain the knowledge because we asked, right? Like, I know this is going to make me feel stupid, but I don't know what you're talking about. And I think that's really the point. I will actually, I'll go one step further to the education piece. I started doing this recently with some of our clients, and that was even with a couple of the owners sending a text message. Hey, I don't know if you saw this article. I think it's prevalent to your organization. I think it's important that you read this article. And sometimes I end up in a dialogue that goes back and forth over several days via text messaging with a business owner. And I'm not saying to like, hey, start sending out your cell phone number to your clients, but there's weight behind what we say. And when we give something that's very narrowly focused, you end up with engagement because you're not giving them this like, oh, I don't have time to read 5 articles. You sent me a newsletter from the desk of Chris Johnson, and I'm like, I just don't have time to read, the 3-page. Delete.
Here's one for you. We don't even market to our clients anymore because our clients respond, hey, is this legit?
Right.
Is this really from you? So we don't even do that anymore. We don't want to raise a red flag coming from us.
Right.
It's like we're like, here's how we're going to communicate with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And we establish that. And if it's not that, then they seem like, oh, well, this is not how they communicate with us. Right.
Right. It's that whole like, click here to reroute your FedEx package. And I'm like, I didn't order anything, but I should find out. This sounds convincing. I want a package. Right. I don't think, and I love it when I hear the whole, the age, the baby boomers, the older generations, and they have the conversation of like, oh, well, if they weren't, it's because they're 70. It's because, no, it's not. It is not. I think that it's easier to talk about it when it is your mom or a grandparent, because they're the ones that are vocally asking for help because it's foreign to them. And I think when it happens to us and the younger generations, it's like, ignore, tuck under a rug, because I don't want to be the one that said something about me doing something foolish, and then it can't be corrected. You ever do like hey, let's do a review of your internal policies with a client? Like, hey, you guys bring your own device. Do you have a policy for that? I mean, it's a one-pager.
It's happening more and more frequently. And so, yes, it is happening. And I think that we're starting to have those conversations more brought up by us, as opposed to responding to the client and their needs. Right. And so I think that is the transformation of being an old school IT, outsourced IT person to a partner with a company when it comes to their business, their strategy, and things of that nature. And it is a morphing, right, that takes place from that, especially when you've been doing it as long as I have. And so, and that was certainly a transformation, but it is way more frequent now. The device policies, and especially when they're, getting insurance policies,
Right.
or, RFQs that they're, or RFPs that they're
Right.
providing to organizations that are, Fortune 500 companies, and they're a company that's my size that is trying to engage with, a multinational organization.
Well, the
It's
world shrunk, right? I remember in the early 2000s when VoIP started to become a real thing, where you could literally have a press 1 for sales, press 2 for support. You didn't have to tell anybody, like, hey, it didn't matter which button you pushed, you were still getting me. That progression that took place, I think, in the early 2000s, as it grew, your Ring Centrals and some of the other products that came out, Vonage, you equalized a playing field, at least on the engagement side. So the 2-man operation might engage with a really big organization, but now cybersecurity has come into play, and it is much more difficult to stay in the engagement if you don't have evidence to support a posture like a large organization would have the capability of doing. Another one that comes to mind for me that I'll call is I don't want to say it's easy necessarily, but I think it's an easy way for engagement, is when you see something happen in the media that is likely going to have some sort of eyebrow raised, hair on back of neck raised with a client, is to create an intentional engagement with them about it. I had an example with a client that I'll use AT&T. So when the AT&T lovely breach happened, I didn't wait, because I knew the client was already sensitive to breaches and security vulnerabilities. So I put together a 1-pager that basically just said, hey, in lieu of the recent events with AT&T, we're recommending that you send this to all of your employees, and these are the steps that they need to take. And oh, by the way, be sensitive and vigilant to things like unsurprised text messages that you weren't expecting from random places. And the response I got back ended up being the CEO of the company asked for a 30-minute call, and he had his entire C-suite on. I say C-suite, I mean, this is a company of like 50 employees. So this isn't big, but they've named C-level, it's like a bank. Might only have 4 employees, but they're a VP of something. And we got on the call, and he goes, what can we do about this? Like, is there more that can be done? And that turned into, I showed them how to get from AT&T it's called security companion. I can't remember the exact name. And it's not cheap. Like, it's like $7 a user. And he immediately put in play that for every employee, effective immediate. My live and learn was that could have been effective immediate coming from me providing that service. But I mean, like, when there's an emotional intimacy to it, they're already listening to you. And the only time we end up not being the quote trusted advisor, especially when we're already in the room, is when we don't say anything. They find somebody else to be the advisor.
very true. Very true. I guess, kind of going back to our conversation, I guess through some messaging that we had, the last thing that really comes to mind from an easy pickings kind of thing to shore up things is know what you're supporting.
Sure.
I mean, know what the assets are that you're responsible for, whether they be, hardware on a network, or even if it's data, whatever it is, know what it is, and protect it to the best of your abilities. I mean, from a networking and hardware endpoint asset perspective, I mean, one of the easiest things that we did was just basically say, okay, on the networks that we support, we're going to know when something tries to attach to it that doesn't belong there, that hasn't been approved, right? I mean, it's a relatively easy thing to do. Initially, it frustrates some clients that want every port active all the time so that they can, but with things being so much more wireless based today than they were in the past, I think that has opened up an area that's kind of an easy thing to put into place for us these days. So
yeah, I think of one of the ones that comes to mind that I don't necessarily think it's it's the little things. It may be a little bit a resource. I don't want to say intense, but it may require some resource effort. Is to do a remediation summary, executive summary. So I think about environments when you come into an environment, especially with an existing client, and you discover like outdated browser that's not getting updated for whatever reason, third-party apps, that kind of thing, which leads to another one, but I'll get to that in a second. To just go in and say, hey, these are pending remediation. These have been remediated as an ongoing conversation. I mean, how many times have you heard an MSP say, we didn't spend enough energy on that engagement, that account management, whatever you want to call it. And so out of sight, out of mind, they found somebody else. And you were doing a great job. And I've heard it from MSPs where like the client left and 2 or 3 years later came back because the services were amazing, but the TLC wasn't there, and they noticed it wasn't there. So someone that's engaging, even if it's to make a sale, was someone talking to them, which kind of leads to the second part of that, and that is, you said it, what are you managing or what are you protecting? Well, what about what your end users are using that are in the cloud, that they're using, say in your case, you mentioned like, multi-factor authentication on email. What happens when that credential is used to get into all of those other locations that don't have any sort of restrictions or enforcements, or maybe the security level that you would require, but you don't even know that they exist? In fact, your client might not even know they exist until you audit. Hey, what is this logging into?
Yeah, that is that kind of shadow or rogue IT, whatever you want to call it. Those types of scenarios, they're always a challenge, and I think there are more and more services coming out to address those types of things, though I haven't found the one that really just jumps out to me that's like, ooh, I gotta have it.
Right.
I think we try and mitigate that through knowing what applications are installed on the devices, and looking at reports and logs to show us when things are there that shouldn't be, and then investigating it from that standpoint. And I think that's an area that we can all do a better job of, because it definitely is a risk. It's a risk that is harder to track down than some of the others that we deal with. And I think that the more and more we engage with the client and pre-business reviews, adding things to our list to look at, to say, how would you like us to address these things that we believe are creating risk for your business?
Right.
And then having the conversation. We can't decide as IT providers exactly how our clients are going to use their technology, right? We can only guide them, and then we have to decide if how they do it is risky to us, and how much risk we're willing to take to do that, right? So I think that it all boils down to the conversations and the engagements that we have with our clients, and not taking advantage of the relationship and thinking that everything that we're doing is always enough, because I don't think that it is. I think that there's always more that we can do, and it's really that simple.
I think, to your point, I remember this was early on in my MSP. We got asked to do an audit for cloud storage services. This is when they were starting to become really hot. You had Google Drive, OneDrive, right? Those were kind of the leaders, but you had things like SugarSync and Box. I mean, there was, and I don't know that it's even dwindled a little bit. I'd say even today, it's probably even, the number of multipliers is out of control. I'm sure there's some formula for it, but this was before things like OwnCloud and NextCloud, where you build your own, really. And the conversation revolved around, where does data live based on corporate strategy around, like, I'm writing a Word document and it gets stored in whatever team drive or whatever. I use that term loosely. So they asked us, they said, we're hardcore Google shop. We want to see all of the data that's being created live and synced to their team or personal drive. Back then, I don't think the product exists anymore, so I won't even say it, but basically it was a tool that would audit cloud services based on the domain. So like, obviously this isn't capturing everything because it was just looking at those that had used the domain for their employer to create their accounts. And it came back with, like, of course, your Sugar Sync. There were some weird ones, and their box was pretty big. But obviously, they were assuming that most of the data would be living in Google because that was the mandate. And to your point, like kind of like shadow IT, what we ended up seeing that was really funny is 80% of content created was down to like 15 to 20 users of an organization of like 600 plus employees. Of that data, 80% of that data being created, only 14% of it was getting put into Google Drive.
Where it was supposed to go. Yeah.
Where it was supposed to go. And so when we looked at the overall data and where it was living, there was no synergy. Like, so not even getting into security, right? There was no synergy on where data was being stored. So you had people storing data in places that aren't going to sync with anybody else. And as we went through the whole process, we discovered that they had such a big problem on their hands. They had to actually have an emergency like game plan to how do we get data back where it's supposed to go, especially when you consider that of the 600 employees, only 15 of them really had to participate in this conversation. And what they found out was that Google Drive was not a good fit for them with how they were doing business. And so basically it was an evolution of like, okay, what do we need to use so that we can secure it, so we can say we know where this data lives? That entire process took all of an hour. Like, we're talking like little things, right? Like, they just told us like, hey, this is how we do business. We're like, what would happen if we check to see where they actually do business?
Yeah. Again, conversations, right?
Right. And again, like we do this a lot because this podcast is really dedicated to cybersecurity. But what is cybersecurity really about? It's about the triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of data. And so I think we don't have to always say, well, today we're talking about password management. Have a great episode. Sure, we can do that. But the reality is, what is it that we're in the room for? Because if we are doing those three things with any data, we are the trifecta. We are actually securing the data. We're securing the people. We're securing the environment. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that by saying, oh, our security services need to be better. And it's like, no, you just need to use this model as you apply your services, whatever they might be.
Sure. Yeah, it's amazing to me. The more that I've learned about it, it's like if I knew then what I know now, how much more effective we could have been early on in securing our clients without any tools at all.
Right.
Just using what we had at the resources that we already had in place. Right. If we would have engaged in the conversations with our clients, we would have been better at what we were doing, and we would have served our clients better overall over that time frame. And for me, it's all about, look, here's where I've been, here's where I'm going, and having conversations with colleagues and peers about that is important, because like my children, I want people that I engage with to learn from my own mistakes and my own shortfalls and all of those kinds of things, because I feel pretty lucky to have been in business for nearly 25 years, right? I mean, yeah. I know it doesn't happen by accident, sure, but in spite of everything else, I do believe that we've weathered some challenging ebbs and flows within the industry that we've seen, and learned some things that younger guys or gals that are engaging in this type of business now could learn from. So, yeah.
I would argue ultimately that if you start an IT services company, well, right now it's just crazy to do that. But I would say, I think that if you look at like 2016, 2018 forward, The tools and resources, their maturity to do this with the automation and some of that stuff is mind-boggling when we look back and say, oh, we were managed service providers, and it was like, we were doing more manually patching than we were automated patching because we had automated patching that was breaking patching.
Sure.
We've been through a lot with this. Building a quote is like, why didn't I just use a spreadsheet? I'd at least got this done. Well, Jim, this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.